Poppy Bush, that's his nickname within the family. Poppy is not this weak, mild-mannered guy who never can make up his mind on anything. He's a more complicated figure. And I began looking at the father, and you will see in Family of Secrets that more than half of the book is about the secret life of George H.W. Bush. What I discovered was that George H.W. Bush basically was not who we thought he was, and then I discovered that George W. Bush was not who we thought he was, and then I discovered that the American history of the last 50 years was not what I thought it was either.
Yeah.
And what I kept finding was so staggering, and I thought, either I'm losing my mind or I'm going to ruin whatever reputation I have. And so I would go to friends of mine who are literally Pulitzer Prize winners of the New York Times, and people at the Washington Post who I know, and I would sit down with them and I would show them what I had. And I was waiting for them to say, oh man, you've really lost it. I think you ought to just hang it up. You know what they said to me? Watch your back. They said, you're getting into some very deep stuff here, and I'd be really careful. It looks solid, but this is dangerous stuff. And they said, we run into some pieces of these things, and we don't cover them, because you just can't. And it's not that that's not a conspiracy. That's just people trying to get by, trying to survive, trying to keep their jobs, trying to pay the rent, keep food on the table. We all face those kinds of moral dilemmas. In any case, looking at the father, one of the things that interested me was that Poppy Bush could not remember. He was interviewed by several media outlets, including Japanese television, and they asked him very innocuously, by the way, Mr. President, where were you when Kennedy was shot in November 22, 1963? And he said, God, gee, I can't remember. And I thought, well, that's so strange, because this is the same guy who didn't remember that Iran-Contra was going on in the White House. He said he was out of the loop. He had already been the director of the CIA. He was, Reagan wasn't running things, we know that, and Poppy Bush was basically largely running the White House. This is another story that hasn't really come out. Who was really running the country all those years? In fact, Bushes, father and son, you know that there's been a Bush either as president or vice president for 20 of the last 28 years? And when they were out of power, Poppy Bush was golfing with Bill Clinton. And now that Barack Obama's in power, our defense secretary was George W. Bush's defense secretary, and Poppy Bush's CIA director. So you see a certain continuity. Okay. Yeah. There are many such examples. In any case, I was fascinated by this Kennedy thing, and I just thought, well, I just wonder where he was November 22. That's all I wondered. Well, unfortunately, this took me down this rabbit's hole I never wanted to go into. I didn't even see it when I fell into it. But what I discovered was I started coming across these declassified government documents, and they're all there for you to see in Family of Secrets. Basically, George H.W. Bush had a reason that he said he couldn't remember where he was. And it wasn't that he couldn't remember, it was that he couldn't say where he was. And basically what I discovered was that, he was CIA director in 1976. And I say to people, do you know that George Bush had a secret life in the intelligence agencies? And everybody says, oh, yeah, he was CIA director. And I say, no. I said, did you know that George Bush had a secret life in the intelligence agencies? That was his public life in the intelligence agencies. Why was he appointed as CIA director in 1976? This is a good question because in 1976 you had something called the Church Committee, which was looking into whether the CIA was out of control, whether it was actually functioning properly as an accountable institution in a democracy, or whether it was something much more dangerous, much more insidious, and much more out of control. And so who did they choose to run the agency? They choose this sort of, nebbishy, wishy-washy guy who can't even make a straight declarative statement, who apparently had no experience in intelligence of any kind, no background in it, and that's who they chose. And go back and read the clippings in the New York Times and so on, and they're all sort of scratching their heads, but nobody would dare to write an article saying, why the hell is this guy being made CIA director at this time? Nobody asked that question, and to this day, nobody asks it. Even those best-selling books with the history of the CIA, none of this is in there. Anyway, I was very interested, and I thought, why was he CIA director? Well, the answer was, and by the way, they named the CIA's new headquarters after him. Not after Allen Dulles, who ran the agency for years and was really a very, very skillful man. Not after Richard Helms, not after any of these other people. They named it after Poppy, who was only there for a year. Well, the reason was he wasn't only there for a year. George H.W. Bush was in the CIA his entire life. George H.W. Bush was our Vladimir Putin. And you see it in these documents. And the amazing thing about these documents is even though they try to suppress documents, even though they try to put false things in documents, you can always find little kernels of truth in these. And that's why the Freedom of Information Act is so valuable. We're the only country in the world that has anything like it. It's a magnificent, magnificent thing. Anyway, he was in the CIA in 1963, and there is a declassified document from J. Edgar Hoover, and he discusses that the day after the assassination, there was a briefing dealing with right-wing anti-Castro Cubans and their movements around the time of the assassination, and the briefing involved two individuals who were named in there. One is a man from the Defense Intelligence Agency, and the other is George Bush of the CIA. Now, this actually came out in an article that ran in the Nation magazine in 1988 as Poppy Bush was being crowned the Republican nominee for president. None of the other media picked it up. They did not somehow think this was interesting. George Bush at first denied that it was him. The CIA denied it was him, which, by the way, they never do. And finally, they issued a statement which right away told you there was something wrong. They said, oh, that was another George Bush. Well, you know right away, I know a lot of people who were in the agency, and as they say, the agency policy is to neither confirm nor deny anything of that sort. So the fact that they obviously felt pressured by Bush's presidential campaign to say it wasn't him, and they named this other fellow named George Bush, but they said, we don't know where he is, we can't find him. Well, this fellow, who wasn't even an investigative journalist, he was writing a book about Frank Capra, who found this document and wrote it up to the Nation, he found this other George Bush. And this man was a low-level employee in some other government agency, and he was recruited by the agency right around the time of the Kennedy assassination for a trial run as almost like an intern at the CIA. And as soon as the assassination was over, they got rid of him. So they were able to say, we had another George Bush there.
Wow.
It's pretty incredible stuff. Anyway, we don't have time to go into all of this. How am I doing? Do I have any time left?
You're doing great.
Okay. There's so much stuff to cover. I mean, I can't even begin to get into it. Well, in any case, there's another document, another CIA classified document, and this shows another reason why Poppy Bush should have remembered where he was that day. We have one document showing that he was in the CIA. Here's another FBI document. This one is from the Houston office, and it says, at 1:45 p.m. on November 22, this is the day that Kennedy assassination, we received a call from a private businessman, George H.W. Bush. He's an oil man of 4224 Briar in Houston, and he called and said he was calling from Tyler, Texas, and he had some information that might be able to be helpful in the investigation of the assassination. And so he then provided the FBI with the name of a fellow he suspected might have had something to do with it. Well, so here it's kind of unusual that he wouldn't remember this day because he called the FBI as a private citizen. Plus, he was working for the CIA in another capacity. He didn't remember any of that. Anyway, in Family of Secrets, I take a whole chapter to explain what that phone call was about. And I come to the conclusion, well, first of all, let me tell you that the man he said he didn't know much about, that he heard rumors that he was threatening Kennedy, he knew this guy perfectly well. And in fact, at the very moment, I discovered, the very moment that at 1:45 that he's calling the FBI, his assistant, Poppy's assistant, is at the man's house, giving him an alibi. So it's a kind of a circular alibi pool. Poppy gets an alibi. He's in Tyler, Texas at 1:45 p.m. as Kennedy's being declared dead. And of course, Tyler, Texas is what? What's the significance of Tyler, Texas? It's not Dallas. It's somewhere else. As it happens, it's about a 10-minute plane flight, and I described whose plane he was on and who this man was and so on. And then I found a lot of other interesting things. For example, I didn't see this, and this is hardly written about anywhere, that Lee Harvey Oswald had a kind of, what was like a father figure in his life in the last year prior to the assassination. It's a Russian guy, and what I discovered was he was a very old friend of, guess who? George H.W. Bush.